The I-70 killer drove these Kansas highways during his murderous road trip in the early 90s. Could he be hiding now in plain sight? Back in 1992, citizens waited with bated breath for police to track down the serial murderer killing innocent strangers in broad daylight. But police never located him. This stunning case of multiple murders across several states had detectives deeply divided. They disagreed on a wide range of things, from complex theories and motives to very simple aspects of the case, like the killer's mode of transportation, or even his number of victims. Were there more that had died by his gun? When a series of attacks cropped up in Texas, detectives didn't know what to think. Witnesses had seen the killer, and ballistics had linked 6 murders, but police have yet to identify and arrest the man called the I-70 killer. This is the story of the continued hunt for that man. Saturday, May 9, 1992, police announced that a serial killer was roaming the highways. The following week, the FBI and officers from 6 police departments gathered in Raytown, Missouri, a suburb of Kansas City, and the location of the killer's most recent attack. They met to compare notes, to share evidence, and to formulate a plan. The killer's ruthlessness and unpredictability created a sense of urgency. In the first days and weeks of their investigation into the I-70 killer, there was an assumption that the next murder was just about to happen, if it hadn't already. At the time, none of them suspected that the killing spree had already ended, and many believed that he would continue to kill until he was caught. But in a move that has since been criticized by some investigators, it had been announced publicly that the crimes were linked by ballistics. And since the day of that announcement, that gun has never been used in another crime. Terre Haute detective Brad Rumsey lamented, quote, "They could have simply said that the mode of operation was similar. Instead, they told the bad guy, 'We know it's the same gun,'" unquote. Forensics experts began comparing evidence recovered from each of the 5 crime scenes, and a Kansas City police detective confirmed that they had recovered physical evidence that he believed would aid police in making an arrest. However, very little of what they had found could actually be tested for DNA in 1992, and the recovery and comparison of fingerprints was very arduous. Some of the stores contained thousands of different prints, and ruling out the meaningless ones was taking a long time. Meanwhile, a multi-state task force of more than 40 police officers from across the Midwest got started on the case. Investigators hit the road, gathering thousands of names from toll booth receipts, traffic tickets, and hotel ledgers. They then compared lists from each of the locations that the killer had struck, looking for names that appeared more than once. Apparently, actor Kevin Costner was on this list. His popular film, The Bodyguard, had just come out that spring, but even Costner's celebrity status could not keep him from suspicions. Retired St. Charles Police Captain Patrick McCarrick recalled that Kevin Costner's vehicle was stopped on the highway. "By the way," he said, "I'm convinced that Kevin Costner is not the I-70 killer. But that's just an example of how comprehensive the approach was." The list of people to look into and names to compare grew and grew, reaching more than 70,000. At the same time, local authorities in towns and cities all throughout the Midwest were on the lookout for the murderer. Saline County Sheriff Darrell Wilson said that they were alerting businesses about the killer, speaking with local owners, and giving out flyers. He advised retail employees to call 911 immediately, saying, quote, "If anyone is acting suspicious, they should notify us as quickly as possible. We'd rather them call and have it not be anything than have them not call." Colby Police Chief Randy Jones was sending his officers out to patrol the outlet malls near their interstate every 15 to 30 minutes. and some were escorting sales clerks to their vehicles. He, too, encouraged citizens to report any suspicious activity, saying, if they're uncomfortable, we want them to call. However, several tense weeks passed, and then months. No additional crimes could be attributed to the I-70 killer. Why had the killings stopped? Where had the gunman disappeared to? Mike Crook, the first homicide detective on the case in Indianapolis, could think of several reasons, saying, quote, could he have been in the military and been deployed again? Could he have killed himself, or just said, the heck with it? Or did he get arrested and get jail time? Investigators checked prison and jail records for a violent man matching their description. They went through records looking at gun charges to see if perhaps someone with a similar weapon had been picked up on something less conspicuous, but no good leads turned up. Initial reports are that he could be a drifter or a hitchhiker, killing for the thrill of it. Raytown Police Captain Larry Overfield said, my personal opinion is that he's a cold-blooded psychopath. Because the rampage had begun in Indianapolis, police focused their efforts on trying to determine if the killer was from the area. Investigators looked at a potential suspect connected to Fort Benjamin Harrison, a U.S. Army post on the northeast side of the city, just a few miles away from the Payless store. But he was soon ruled out. Detective Crook asked the FBI for assistance, and they got to work creating a profile of the killer. Profilers believed that the I-70 killer had some sort of traumatic background that led him to kill. Could he have been a part of the military or ex-military and suffering from PTSD? Witnesses had reported that the man was about 5'7" with a small to medium build. He was slightly shorter than the average adult male. Could he have been on the receiving end of bullying for his shorter stature? He had appeared to witnesses as scruffy and unkempt, but Detective Crook called the killer charming, and he said that he had used that charm to convince Robin Foldauer to show him the back of the Payless shoe store where she was murdered. The killer, who had been wearing dirty clothes and talking to himself, what could he have said to set Robin at ease? Profilers believed that something recent had occurred in the killer's life to set off the killing spree. They also found it likely that his first attack in Indianapolis would have been close to his home. After that, it was clear that he scouted his locations, choosing victims in quiet businesses and strip malls along I-70 or I-35. Were these places selected off of the interstate to make for an easy exit? Special attention was paid to Wichita and to this part of his route here, because why go 700 miles from Indianapolis all the way to Wichita, Kansas, kill 2 people, and then turn around and go back to Indiana, to Terre Haute, to kill somebody else? Detective Tim Rolfe of the Wichita Police Department believed that he had to have a reason to be in Wichita. Could he have been a truck driver? Someone with a reason to be driving these highways? None of the witnesses could recall seeing any big rigs parked near the crime scenes, or any vehicles at all. Several eyewitnesses had reported seeing a suspicious man matching the killer's description trying to hitch a ride, and so some of the investigators believed that the killer was a hitchhiker, but others didn't think it was possible for him to make it all that way without any witnesses if he wasn't traveling in his own vehicle. All of the opposing opinions, the witnesses, and the clues complicated the case, causing a frustrated Assistant Police Chief Joe Newport to say, quote, "We don't even know what the hell we're looking for." As for a motive, the FBI profilers thought that after the first kill, that it became almost a game to him. That the thrill of killing in daylight at shopping centers with witnesses nearby, it became an interesting challenge. And when the press got hold of the story and news broke out about what he had done, that perhaps he didn't stop, but got spooked and scaled back to petty theft or lesser crimes. FBI profiler Larry Ankrum believed that the killer could be fulfilling a fantasy. He spoke with writer-reporter Bob Cypers, who described the situation as, quote, "He's planned this in his mind. He knows what he's going to do. He's driving down the highway. He picks a spot. He finds a girl by herself. He kills her. And then, almost like a sexual event, it's over. He has to go someplace and literally collapse." Unquote. Agents from the FBI lab in Quantico went through the psychological profiling process twice. Both times, their results suggested that the killer was from Indiana and that he was fulfilling a fantasy. They also concluded that the killer had an emotional connection to his weapon. Detective Tim Rolfe of the Wichita Police Department believed that he was probably a collector of weapons. The gun, which at first they thought was maybe an Intratec Scorpion, was eventually narrowed down to the Urmawerka ET-22, which detectives referred to as unusual. And that's not just because guns are, in general, unusual weapons for serial killers. The Urmawerka was a long-barreled, semi-automatic .22 caliber pistol that had been popular with the German Navy in World War I, and it had been primarily used for target shooting. Prone to jamming and malfunctions, the Urmawerka was not known for being a reliable gun, and its barrel was almost a foot long, making it not very easy to conceal. Additionally, it was quite rare, with less than 7,000 made and imported from Germany. Officials wondered if it had actually been passed down within the killer's family. The .22 caliber bullets recovered from the scene were CCI brand copper-clad lead bullets. They were marked with a curious red substance, which investigators later determined to be an industrial-strength abrasive known as jeweler's rouge. They speculated that prior to an attack, the killer would rub each bullet casing with the rouge to either polish off his fingerprints or to allow the bullets to slide more easily into the chamber. Some detectives felt that the use of this rouge meant that the killer worked in the metalworking industry, while others believed that it was a clear sign that the killer was making and assembling his own guns. Donald Waterhouse had been a depressed Navy sailor and radio operator who slit his own throat in the middle of dinner with his crew, 2 days before New Year's Day, 1992. He was released to his mother's care and ordered to attend therapy. But Donald's relationship with his mother had been tumultuous. Donald blamed Ella Louise for his father's absence during his childhood, and during his deployment with the Navy, her letters and phone calls had never made it through to him, isolating Donald and further damaging their relationship. He received treatment for clinical depression, but tensions in their rural Tennessee house were high. On Leap Day, February 29th, just 9 days before the I-70 killer's first murder, Donald shot and killed his mother and stepfather. He had used a .22 caliber gun. On the run from authorities, Donald fled. Investigators found his stepfather's truck the following day. It had been abandoned in St. Louis, right off of I-70. Described as 5'6" and 145 pounds, Donald seemed like a really good fit for their suspect. The FBI was called in to compare evidence, but the ballistics didn't match, and police announced that he was no longer a person of interest. Nothing tied him to the I-70 killer. The summer of 1992 had been an industrious one, with several suspects ruled out and dozens of law enforcement officers working full-time on the case. Progress to an arrest seemed inevitable. But despite the hundreds of hours of intensive detective work, that August they admitted publicly to having no suspects and turned to America's Most Wanted, hoping that the national broadcast would drum up leads. And it did. With a fresh batch of tips to follow up on, officers stayed busy throughout that winter and the following year. But the eerie absence of the killer kept everyone on edge. Raytown Police Chief Chris Turnbow said, "If he's a true serial killer, which we believe that he is, it is not uncommon for him to take what you might call a sabbatical. He may be waiting to see if police are closing in." But police weren't closing in. They continued to interview, investigate, and debate, and soon there were even more attacks to consider. Mary Ann Thacker was a 51-year-old antiques dealer who owned Emporium Antiques in Fort Worth, Texas. She had been divorced for several years, but many people still knew her by her married name, Mary Ann Glasscock. Mary Ann loved music and was a well-regarded organist who performed locally for many years. She also taught music at Tarleton State University. Mary Ann was well known in the antiques community as a quilt expert and as someone who was conscientious about security in the antiques business. Mary Ann had been a founding member of the Tarrant Antique Dealers Association, a group formed to stop shoplifters and catch thieves attempting to resell their loot at other stores. Her own store, Emporium Antiques, was located in a strip mall off of I-35. She used an elaborate security system and had installed iron bars on her shop windows. These measures helped to make her feel safe at the store, following an armed robbery a few years prior. But sadly, our repairman discovered Mary Ann's body in the back of the shop. Mary Ann had been shot once in the back of the head sometime around noon that Saturday. Her car keys, driver's license, and a small amount of money was missing from the register. Just like the I-70 killer's previous attacks, Mary Ann's murder was an execution-style slaying midday at a small retail store near the interstate. Despite the killing occurring during lunchtime across the street from a restaurant with a busy patio, no one had seen or heard anything. 5 weeks later, and 15 miles away in Arlington, Texas, Amy Vess was attacked at a dance apparel store called Dancer's Closet. Amy was a 22-year-old student at University of Texas at Arlington. She was described as sweet and loving and was engaged to be married. Somehow, after being shot twice, Amy was able to summon the strength and the courage to get to a phone and call 911.
Stop. Okay. Do you need an ambulance? Okay. Where are you hurt?
Paramedics rushed to the scene, and Amy was taken to a nearby hospital where doctors worked tirelessly to save her, but ultimately failed. Amy died the following day. Only a small amount of money had been stolen, but an entire life had been taken away. 4 hours south and 75 days later, at a store called Alternatives Gift Shop, Vicki Webb was working when a man approached her with a question about a picture frame. Before she could even turn around to respond, he shot her in the back of the head. Vicki fell to the floor and played dead while he took $75 in cash from the register. Next, the man rolled her over and pulled her pants down to her ankles, though he did not sexually assault her. When the gunman realized that Vicki was still alive, he tried to shoot her in the forehead, but his gun misfired. The man chuckled to himself about the error before fleeing the scene. Later, a couple came into the store and found Vicki lying on the ground. An ambulance was called and she was rushed to the hospital. Doctors were sure that if she could survive, that she would be paralyzed from the waist down. However, they instead discovered that a genetic abnormality had given Vicki a larger than normal spinal column. And so, against all odds, Vicki survived and can walk. Unbelievably, doctors were unable to remove the bullet, which is still lodged in her spine to this day. The bullets had been .22 caliber, and ballistics linked these Texas attacks to each other, but not to the I-70 killings from 1992. However, because the MO was so similar, several officers from the I-70 task force came to Texas to survey the crime scenes and talk to investigators. Today, detectives are divided 50-50 on whether or not the crimes were committed by the same killer. Mike Crook, homicide investigator from Indianapolis, visited the crime scenes, and he believes that it has to be him. But St. Charles detective Pat McCarrick was not convinced. "I am the definition of the split decision," he said. When she saw the suspect sketch of the I-70 killer, Vicki Webb identified him as the man who had wandered suspiciously through the Alternatives gift shop before shooting her. But apparently no physical evidence ties the two crime sprees together, making these three attacks just three more questions in the endless list of questions and confusions when it comes to the I-70 case. As the years passed, many thousands of leads were pursued, and it has been reported that over the course of this case, officials have received more than 100,000 tips. There have been several publicly named suspects. In 1994, police arrested career criminal Lonnie Weissman, only to discover that he had been in prison at the time of the I-70 murders. In 1996, police named Robert Craig Cox as a suspect. Cox was a dishonorably discharged Army Ranger already sitting in a Texas prison for holding a gun to a 12-year-old girl during an armed robbery. With a rap sheet of many numerous crimes and ties to the Midwest, he was also considered as a suspect in the infamous Springfield 3 case, the abduction of Suzanne Streeter, Stacy McCall, and Cheryl Levitt. However, no evidence has been uncovered to conclusively tie him to either case. In 2001, the FBI questioned an Indiana man facing a rape charge named Randall Bishop. His appearance matched the composite sketches, and police were intrigued by his job as a truck driver, but DNA ruled him out as a suspect. That same year, November 30th, 2001, a gunman walked into the 7th and 70 liquor store in Terre Haute, Indiana, and shot Billy Brossman in the back of the head. It happened just 7 blocks from where Mick McCown had been killed. Security camera footage from the scene shows the gunman in terrifying detail as he approaches the counter with a 6-pack of beer before pulling a gun on the clerk. Billy sets out the cash register drawer and then walks to the back of the store, where he was later found shot dead. 31-year-old Billy was described as a loving husband and father of 2. Police haven't released the full video, but parts of it were shared with the media. Writer-reporter Bob Cyphers has said that after shooting Billy Brossman, the man does what Bob described as a, quote, little celebratory jig. He does not even return to the counter for his beer. Authorities describe the killer as 5'8" to 6 feet tall, with a medium build and thinning hair. He was clean-shaven, wearing jeans and a shiny black jacket. But despite having video of their killer, investigators were unable to locate him. For several years, the case was at a dead end. Again, authorities turned to America's Most Wanted for leads, and it appears to have paid off. Something about the way the killer was dressed and the way that he acted on the video jogged a tipster's memory, and that helped lead investigators to a suspect. Terre Haute police prepared a murder warrant for this man, but the local prosecutor's office refused to sign on to it. This suspect is said to resemble sketches of the I-70 killer, and this paired with a similar MO and the proximity of Billy Brossman's death with Mick McCown's crime scene has led investigators to believe that the killers could be one and the same. But once again, a connection could not be conclusively made. More time passed, another 10, and then 15 more years. In 2014, the St. Charles Police Department purchased an Irma Werka Model ET-22 pistol from an online auction and test-fired it to ensure that it wasn't the actual murder weapon. It wasn't, but they also did initiate a push to publicize the gun more. Police released a flyer of information on the murder weapon and called out to gun collectors and enthusiasts, asking them to share the information and to notify authorities if they came across a similar gun or if they knew of one stolen in the early 90s. In 2021, Captain Ray Floyd of the St. Charles Police Department brought everyone together again to renew the task force. It had been years since representatives of all of the police departments had worked together to investigate the Interstate 70 killer. In that time, some of the original investigators had retired, and Captain Floyd wanted to bring together all of the new detectives and put them in the room with those still around from the beginning. He had also hired Kelly Rhodes, a detective whose sole job was to work the I-70 case and retrace the killer's movements from the very beginning. Technology was also changing, and new options were now available to detectives and forensic scientists looking to find and identify DNA from the crime scenes. Terre Haute Police Sergeant Troy Davis said, quote, "Every case has some piece of evidence that can possibly yield a DNA sample that's going to be valuable for us to use. I think absolutely there's a strong chance we can identify the person. There's a lot of ways. Maybe this guy is a convicted felon somewhere and has his DNA in the system," unquote. Multiple departments sent pieces of evidence to be tested, holding out hope for a successful match. Police in Indianapolis investigating Robin Fulltower's murder had turned up hairs. But so far, the DNA recovered has not matched to anyone. And it seems that includes Harry Edward Greenwell, the recently identified I-65 killer. It was DNA that linked Greenwell to 3 motel killings along highways between 1987 and 1990. The I-70 murders happened just 2 years later, a time frame that Captain Floyd called hard to ignore. But Harry Edward Greenwell, who has since passed, was much older and taller than the I-70 suspect that witnesses described. And Bob Cyphers told A&E in 2024, quote, "As of right now, the DNA has been a dead end for everything they've tested." However, not all hope is lost. Detective Rhodes said that not a week goes by that they don't receive new tips. Quote, "We've gotten so many calls, so many leads of people now bringing forth information." Detective Rhodes said that everything they do is for the families of the victims who have waited decades for answers. All of these years later, there are still so many unknowns. Mark Majors, husband of slain Trish Majors, reopened that bridal shop in Wichita shortly after his wife's murder, but couldn't take being there. He sold it just 5 months later. He never remarried, telling the Wichita Eagle in 2014 that Trish had been his best friend. And while he's no longer haunted by her death, he really hasn't moved on. Mark does hope for resolution still, and he said all it takes is one person to make the connection and to call Crime Stoppers or police or somebody. If he's still out there, all he has to do is slip up once. There is a $25,000 reward for information in this case. And if you have any information, please reach out to the St. Charles Police Department.